Hey, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's message further. My name is Jeremy, and I'm your host. And this is a podcast where we just want to ask the questions that we think that you would ask as it relates to Sunday's message. And as we do so, we hope that it helps you grow in your life and your faith. With that being said, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of the podcasts that are coming out. Not only that, hit the like button, because when you do so, it helps us help other people. And if you ever have a question about Sunday's content or about Overtime, you can submit those to overtime@npaustin.com, and we will be sure to get to those in future podcasts. So with that being said, here's a quick recap of Sunday, and then we're going to jump into our conversation today.
If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. And it says one of the 12 disciples, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, was not with the others when Jesus came. But he replied, I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands. He started a statement, I won't believe it unless. And then he had crystal clarity about what goes in that gap. So I'm curious for you, do you know what the current barrier is for you? Sometimes people just grasp at straws trying to account for the appearances, but nothing fits all the evidence better than the explanation that Jesus was alive. Amazingly, that's not where Thomas's story ends. The disciples were together again, and this time Thomas was with them. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and look at my hands. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. The resurrection is at the center of all history and has the potential to be at the center of your very personal story.
All right. So I have been planning for and excited for how I wanted to kick off this podcast.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Yep. What'd you guys think of the Masters?
Actually, I was watching it. I did watch the last 6 holes, maybe.
I literally had this moment where I pulled open the leaderboard or whatever it's called, and I saw names. I saw Brooks Koepka at the top, and I was I had this elf moment. I know him. I was so excited. Oh, I know that name. And, man, he's been struggling the past couple of years. I kind of hope he gets it, but he also wasn't portrayed.
He was winning, and then
and then he fell apart in the last day. He didn't. Well, he went. He had 5 bogeys in a row, and then he got 4 birdies, but he just never fully recovered. Mm-hmm. And then the guy who won it, Ram, I don't know how to say Ram. He just had an unbelievable day, and he just pulled ahead. It was wild.
I started watching basically when it was already over, so.
It was exciting. I've usually been man, I'm not super interested in it. And then you watch Phil Mickelson start to make his way up at the top. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine Koepka or Mickelson being live guys winning?
Well, 3 of the
Masters.
top 5 were live guys.
Yeah. Well, I don't know who was the other one. Koepka, Mickelson, Henley, Reed.
There was somebody tied for 3rd. That was below that, I guess.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I've never had a Masters Sunday where I just finished a 5th service, and so I wasn't super locked in Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, that's fair.
I could not imagine you turning on the Masters and staying awake long enough to watch.
Just trying to remember where I was at, what my name was.
Yeah,
I was with my mother Easter Sunday. She made some good food. It was fantastic.
Nice.
Yeah, it was good.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, proud of you though, Jeremy.
Thank
I like
you.
the picture that you sent Josh and I. That's good.
Yeah. Well, you were pretty on point too about nothing defines fatherhood more than this picture. My feet up on the couch watching golf on a Sunday afternoon.
Full dad mode.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, I don't know if I should be proud, ashamed. Not sure.
What was the comment that you made though? Something about a touchdown or?
Oh, well, I said really.
Brady's gonna win.
I thought you guys would appreciate that.
I thought that was hilarious.
Okay.
I was dying laughing. I had to explain the whole situation. I was with my mom as well. And I had to explain.
Well, for context for those listening, I said really pulling for Brady in this one.
Oh yeah, that's right. Brady. It's a Tom Brady reference.
Which for those of you who know sports like me, you'll know that he's a football player. That's what's funny about that. So.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah. I just wanted to clarify. I know there's some people previous, a month ago me, that wouldn't understand the sports comments, but I'm totally kidding. I don't know what I'm talking about. I recognize 2 of the 100 and something names in the Masters tournament, so just got excited about that.
I saw you on Netflix.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I like it.
Anyways, we're not here to talk about golf, and our listeners, watchers are thankful for that. They're done with it. They've heard enough. So we are coming off of the week of Easter.
What a transition.
Yeah, there's no good way to. I mean, it was Easter weekend Masters, so there's some overlap there, but
Yep.
A really amazing weekend though. Like just to pause and we had 5 services and streaming online and people in person had 1,700 ish people in the auditorium. Plus, I don't even know how many kids and students were around too, but it's just absolutely amazing weekend. And Jordan, thought you did a phenomenal job.
Thank you, sir.
I think that was your first time doing anything that would have a stretch of 5 the same message back to back, right?
Right.
And that's pretty nutty. We've done 4, back in the day, but 5 would be a whole new territory.
Yep. Yeah, it was funny. I was thinking about our 4-service season when we're just trying to rearrange them all and just couldn't find the way to make them fit. But it's weird that we did that for a season after doing 5 this week. I was like, how was that every Sunday? But yeah, what's crazy to me is like there was a really cool energy to like every service. I mean, it was like people showed up. It was awesome. It was celebratory. It was like it's just really great.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just want to say too, if anybody's listening or watching that are just brand new to Northpoint as a result of Easter, like we're stoked you're here listening and watching. We hope today's stuff is helpful. Today, what we really try to do is we take what happens on Sunday. A lot of times, there's a lot more to say about any particular topic within 40 minutes, that's on Sunday and a message that we have time for. And so overtime is really to unpack some of the things that we didn't have time to get to and talk about any of the questions you might have given the content on Sunday in hopes that it just helps you really go further, faster in your life and your faith. And so that's what we're going to do relating to Easter, but we're also today kind of looking at what we kind of are pseudo thinking about part 5 of this series that we've been in the past couple of weeks called Investigating Jesus. And the reason is because we can't really investigate Jesus and avoid investigating the resurrection. I mean, it really is like the pinnacle of it. Like it's everything hinges on it. Both the identity of Jesus, which when you take Jesus at his claim to be God, it gives some validity to the resurrection story, and it makes that possible, right? We talked about that a little bit last week in Overtime podcast of how all that kind of stuff interconnects. But the resurrection, I mean, without the resurrection, I mean, the movement would have just died. That is Christianity. And so everything, like you said, our preaching, our faith is useless without the resurrection. And so for someone listening today, wondering, even just based on Sunday, I'm sure Sunday's content was helpful. We talked about Thomas, who got the nickname Doubting Thomas, and just, how unfortunate that was for him. That's kind of how he got labeled. But at the same time, he's very relatable for a lot of us because we hear the story of the resurrection and our instant reaction is, well, how is that possible? How do we know that actually happened? What's the evidence for that? And so you talked about some of those things on Sunday, but we really wanted to take this podcast and dive in a little bit further into the evidence of the resurrection. And so today, what I want to do is kind of just have an open discussion between you and I about stuff that we've heard, we've thought through, we've learned, we've read around these 2 kind of central questions with the resurrection. If someone is investigating the resurrection of Jesus, they're asking, did that really happen? There are these 2 main questions that kind of an investigative journalist would tackle. We know these questions come from Lee Strobel's book, Case for Christ. And the first question is, did Jesus really die? And the second question is, afterwards, did people really see him alive? Those are the 2 most important questions, because if he didn't die, well, then there was no resurrection. But if people didn't see him really alive afterwards, well, again, there was no resurrection. And so those 2 questions have to be the answer yes in order for us to believe that the resurrection is really an actual event that occurred in history. And so we've talked a little bit about, did Jesus really die? But I'll just punt to you to start, and then we can go back and forth on it. But, that being the first question, how would you talk about that, answer that, unpack that as much as we can here?
Yeah. Well, I think even zooming out just like a little bit,
Sure.
Because of what you started with, Thomas, I was, inherent in his story is the idea that like in the scriptures themselves, we have like an endorsement of what we're doing right now, which I think is really interesting. It's like in the Bible, you have an invitation to ask questions, like that, and an honest Christian will invite honest answers, and it's not something that we have to shy away of or be afraid of. And part of that is like, if you have a peace and confidence that what you believe is true, like that's exactly what you should want people to do. Like you should want people to explore, not respond with a just believe or just trust or whatever, and so I think that was something that was cool. That was like a takeaway for me in studying his story. And I was curious too, and there's some time restraints on Sunday, you know, but even in pausing when we asked that question, when he was like, I won't believe unless, you know, I can touch his hands, I can touch his side. And we asked the question of like, what's in that blank for you? I was curious, you know, do people maybe even recognize that they set themselves up in such a way that there could be nothing, you know, and that if God did act in history, like we wouldn't believe it? Because like one of the common pushbacks to, you know, any given person would be like, well, anybody can say, anybody can claim, anybody can do, right? So even in that statement that will, like, you know, different religious leaders or, you know, maybe dismantle other religions as false religions or whatever, that's one of the arguments anybody can claim that. And so then I think about like, okay, so you would need God to do something that not anybody can do, right? Like apparently like in that pushback is like, and then I don't believe something that is unbelievable.
Yeah.
You know? So I kind of set up this
you know what I mean? Thing that
right.
Happens,
it's like, and so, okay, God did something that yes, nobody else could do, but hold on, like, wait, resurrection can't happen. So therefore I don't believe it. And it's like, well, you actually have kind of set up this false premise. So it's just, I love the story of Thomas for like so many reasons, because it really just, in just a few like, you know, sentences and a few pieces of context, like gets us really thinking and diving into the heart of the matter, you know? So, and then I think, I mean, obviously to answer, you know, your question, there's multiple different places that we could go to. I think one of the things that's interesting is the method with which Jesus died is one of the most foolproof methods that has ever been invented to end a life, because there are so many fail safes, right? I mean, you talked about I was going to say the Friday, it was like a Good Friday message, but it was, you know, the Sunday before, that even in the flogging process, that people would oftentimes not survive that there would be enough blood loss, dehydration, organs start to fail, and so on, that people may not even, and there's a world where who knows, like maybe he would have if he was just left to his injuries, you know, and so on. And so like already before he even like gets to the cross, there is a foolproof, like, you know, system built in. Then you talk about the process of being on a Roman cross, and the way that you die is actually through suffocation, and a Roman soldier being responsible for making sure that, you know, whoever is crucified dies, because if they don't, then the Roman soldiers, not just profession, but their own life is on the line. And so thus you get the spear thrust through the side. So the fact that is the chosen method, and then you have this incredible amount of biblical evidence, which we talked about that on Sunday, why just throwing away all of the Bible because you don't like parts of the Bible would be a really like odd way to approach. Does it have any validity historically? Even if you just chose the Gospels, like even if you just started there, or the New Testament, or, you know, as you go document by document.
Right.
But then the highlighting of multiple extra biblical authors as well, that there are all kinds of just historians of the moment that talked about the crucifixion of Jesus. It would be to such an overwhelming degree, the amount of evidence that's available to us, that you would have to, and it's not an exaggeration, like you would have to deny all of ancient history. Like there would be nothing else that has like a higher standard or more evidence or proof than us until like photography and videos showed up on the scene. Yeah. And I like how you even joked, like even that was a very narrow window. It was like maybe the 80s or 90s, because like now we got Photoshop, so you can't trust those either. So it's like, you know, I mean, it truly is overwhelming. And there's a lot of pieces that we could keep going down the rabbit hole in terms of like, just the fact that there's any evidence would cause any honest historian to pause, right? Because it's like, wait, why didn't Caesar, with his resources at his hand, have the same amount of evidence about his life as this, you know, Jewish carpenter from a truly like middle of nowhere city? I mean, it's like a middle armpit of Texas or something, like, you know, Nazareth. Like, why would we have this overwhelming evidence about his life? And so, for me, those are all the pieces when we go to like overwhelming that he lived, overwhelming that he was sentenced to death and why, and then the avenue by which, you know, he was killed. And then in addition to that, all of the proper responses that you would expect from his followers of giving up hope, the movement is over, and so on, starts to build a really substantial body of evidence that I don't know of. Like there's not a historian like that I could name for you that would like suggest that didn't happen. It does seem to be something that is brought up, because I start to realize, if Jesus is a real person who died, you know, who was crucified, and he was crucified for that claim, like for that claim to be God, it already starts to have some implications. Like I already have to chase down, we talked about the liar, lunatic, Lord, like that already narrows for me. Like, okay, he either was crazy, he either was evil, or there was some truth to what he claimed, which has a lot of implications for my life. And so people would much rather come up with a what if scenario, specifically because you can't just like believe that and realize like, oh, but there's no implications to me, because there would be implications to all of us.
Right.
And so, and I actually, the body of evidence for the resurrection would be just as strong. It just involves something that we don't believe is physically, scientifically possible. At least we know and can accept people die. We all do. So it's like, okay, that part at least I don't have as much pushback on, most people. But part of the reason that people want to start there, that he wasn't killed, is because of, well, now there's so much claiming that he was seen after the fact.
Yeah.
That if I just invalidate like nothing supernatural can exist, then I've got to go back really to the crucifixion because of the overwhelming resurrection evidence. So
and it is really interesting too, because I think the you think about the Quran being written in 600, 700 BC. After Christ.
AD,
AD. And it does not like it talks about Jesus as a prophet. It does not say that he like didn't. He wasn't seen after his death. What it most likely pushes on is that he didn't die. And this is that swoon theory. And it's interesting that like 600 years after, that the thing that it tackles the most is that he didn't die, because there was overwhelming evidence about this movement that happened and these people who claimed that they saw Jesus alive.
Right.
And so I just think it is really fascinating. And I love your point about, I won't believe unless you give me something divine to prove that it's true, and then the very thing that would be divine to prove that it's true, we go, I can't believe that.
Unbelievable.
Right. That's such a, I had never thought of that. That's such like a powerful point, and I think that's where probably a lot of people find themselves on, and they don't really give themselves the urge or the I don't know the emphasis to like do something about that tension.
Yeah.
So which is it? Do you want something that's going to prove it, and are you open to that actually being true, or are you just not willing to believe that something like that could happen?
Maybe we can talk about that next Easter.
Yeah. Maybe there's content for next
I actually
Easter.
know people that have that exact tension.
Yeah.
With faith and just like the existence of God, going back to what y'all talked about last week, and they were like, if God is all powerful, why can't he just like show himself to me? But it's like, but you wouldn't believe it if he did, kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's just so interesting. It's kind of a circular argument, circular conversation.
Yeah, it is. But I think the conversation around did Jesus really die, just for people who have like thought about that is called this, people call that the swoon theory. And it is this idea that he swooned, he just fainted, he didn't fully expire. But there is, you have a far more difficult time arguing that he fainted, he didn't fully die, than you would for the overwhelming evidence that he did actually expire on the cross. And so I think, and I feel like we touched on a lot of that in part 4 of the series, and even talking about that in the podcast afterwards too. And so let's shift our energy towards the second question. Afterwards, did people really see him alive? What's our evidence for that? How do we know that? What are the ways in which you would start to kind of talk about that or unpack that if someone were to ask you that, just sitting down, having coffee, that kind of thing? Where would you go with that?
Yeah, well, I actually, I don't, maybe we would do this a lot in overtime, but this almost feels like more than normal crucial to have like seen Sunday first, because I really do. I think that would be the starting point. Like, I think I would start with the Bible, like with the scriptures, but I gave a lot of kind of prefacing content as to why I would go there first. So not just because like the Bible says or because it's respected or whatever. We talked about why it's respected, and I would want to start with like what's the best evidence and the best, most comprehensive writings we have on the resurrection, and to me the most compelling in terms of who are the people that wrote them, are what we have protected in the scriptures, and that's why they were included in there. And so for me, there's a lot that we could go through. I do think Paul is an absolutely fascinating case study in terms of all kinds of power and authority, and he sacrifices all of that for a brutal existence. I mean, when you go through the New Testament and you start to talk about like the flogging that we talked about with Jesus, like he experiences that multiple times, as a result of his newfound faith in Christ, shipwrecked and snake bitten, and the whole list that he gives. Like,
in prison so much.
Writes multiple of these letters from a prison cell, and like all he's got to do at any point is was like, yeah, I didn't actually see a resurrected Jesus. So there are like way too many things that would have cost him in terms of like everything he'd worked for his whole life, trained as a Pharisee, like to throw in the towel for all of that, his standing as a Roman citizen, utilizing his Roman authority, and then to think about the way in which he was then persecuted after the fact, just to travel. And I mean, it's just, he's a really, I mean, there's a whole, N.T. Wright has like a massive book just on Paul, you know, and it's like an amazing person to dive into. I think oftentimes, you know, James, the reason I pause on him is maybe it's just because I have one brother. And I think it even is elevated by the fact that I do have a lot of respect for my brother, you know, even though he's like the younger one. I've always been learning from him. I go to him for expertise in all kinds of things, especially like business and leadership and so on. And I'm just like, I'm not close to thinking like he could be God. You know what I mean? Yeah. I could see him walk on water. I could see him fly like Superman. Like there's nothing that like would be like, yeah, that's him. Like, you know what I mean? And he would say the exact same about me. So it's just the compelling nature of the fact that like Jesus even speaks to his family, you know, alienated from him. And then James writes a letter in our New Testament post-resurrection, and James has that famous scene of like fighting to not make it difficult in Acts 15. We're not going to make it difficult for Gentiles that are turning to God, like
turning to my brother.
Right,
God.
exactly. Yeah. That is so compelling and overwhelming to me. I do find the disciples as well like to think about Matthew documenting a gospel, to think about John, to think about Peter, like the fact that they were gone and that's what you would expect. I find their age compelling. And I really find the fact that they would have known if Jesus didn't die, or they would have known that the resurrection never happened. They never saw him again. Yeah. And to consistently across the board go like 12 for 12 persecution on all they have to do is like no, he didn't. He is not God. You know, he didn't rise from the dead. And I try to make that point. I mean, it was one quick line on Sunday, but you do see people give, you know, soldiers for your country. I mean, in modern day, all the time, people die for what they believe in. You do not see people die for the lie, die for what they know did not happen, especially with that consistency, especially how young they were. Like, that's just like, you know, that's not what you see. And so for me, you know, incredibly compelling. I find it compelling that it took root in the culture that it did, right? So one of the core fundamental beliefs, and this is, Islam has this core issue with Christianity today, is God can't become human. Like that is the ultimate betrayal of the ultimate blasphemy, to say like God is so holy, like so perfect. So he has an unpronounceable name, and Yahweh is the best we can come to it with. And to believe that God came as a baby, that he bled, that he was tortured, that he had human limitations for a time, like that is like, there's not a greater like insult to everything they believe in and stand for, the foundation of their whole worldview. And for them, by the thousands, to switch to that very belief that this man was God solely because of the resurrection, like solely because we saw him again. Like that's remarkably compelling. It's a context and a culture that was not like primed for that. It wasn't like, well, it was all set up and that was just the next natural step along the way. And so to me, the culture and the worldview in which it took root is fascinating. A lot of the details I think that we talked about in the scriptures, the fact that it was women first that found the empty tomb. There are like small details like that you wouldn't include in there if you were trying to create a legend or a myth to carry. So I find all of that to be fascinating as well. And some of those historians have the same things to talk about the movement, you know, being silent for a moment, the disease being silent for a moment, and then taking off again. Like they acknowledge the switch, which is something that is fascinating to me as well. So I think I find that compelling, and then I find incredibly not compelling the arguments against, you know, mass hallucinations is something that we have absolutely no evidence of happening ever in any scenario in history. One person on drugs, sure. Like you don't have hundreds of people all experiencing the same hallucination at the same time, right? Like a big crowd, we're all seeing the same Jesus telling us the same words and preaching the same sermon in our craziness. And right, it's like a completely baseless theory to me. And that's the kind of straws that seem to be grasped at, because we have to acknowledge like something happened.
And we have to explain it somehow.
Right, exactly. And so everyone that I've ever seen is not like, oh, that's kind of interesting. It's been like so pulled out of thin air and nowhere. And it shows to me the desperation to try to dismantle it, that again, the more I go down to all of those, like, it's compelling.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that I would say, like, that's all evidence. And one of the things that we try to, like, I try to allude to a little bit is, like, it's multiple fields, like, that come together in this. And so this is kind of just the historical aspect of it. Then there are theological pieces of what happens in a death and a resurrection for me that makes my lived experience, like, it's extraordinary, that I think about now. The implications of that are so amazing. To me, it does seem divine, but
well, that's one of the things too, in terms of multiple different fields coming together. One of the pushbacks is that when you read the description of the empty tomb scene in all four gospels, there are, like, some small differences, minor discrepancies between them. Mm-hmm. And from a philosophical standpoint, like, philosophy would throw, if there's one piece of it that's different, then you throw the whole thing out. Mm-hmm. But a historical perspective says the core of the story is the same, and the minor discrepancies between them actually make it more credible historically. Yeah. Like, it's like a trial in which there's two eyewitnesses and their accounts are too identical. It means they've collaborated. They've made it more unlikely. Yeah. Versus there being these minor discrepancies, but the core of the story remains the same. Yeah. Makes it far more credible in believing that it's true.
Evidence is thrown out that overlaps too much. Yeah. Right? Because it literally, in our current modern legal system, it's thrown out because they assumed exactly what you just said, that there was collaboration ahead of time. So if somebody now from Ask, how the podcast went today, and you, me, and Josh all describe it and what we talked about, we're going to say generally the same thing with some slightly different details that stood out to each of us. All of our accounts are true of what took place in here, but they're not going to be like the word for word highlight the same details and so on.
And I find it so interesting when you start to explore faith in Christianity and read the New Testament, that when you read, so often in church, the more of the heart stuff is what we talk about. Like, it's terms of all the different things about how Jesus meets us in our life and how we grow our faith and all this kind of stuff. That's what Paul, but when you read these little bits and pieces at the beginning and the end of these documents, it's like you read the words where Luke said, like, I've carefully investigated, I've gone to the eyewitnesses. You read John and you read John referencing signs and wonders throughout his entire gospel account. And then at the end, he's saying, I've written about all these signs and wonders so you may know, you may believe, with credibility. You read Paul, in Corinthians, and he gives the Apostles' Creed, and he says, what I have received, I've passed down to you. And he's, like, corroborating the evidence as well, talking about the 500 eyewitnesses. Like, the New Testament documents really read from a standpoint of, like, a whole bunch of Thomases in a way, of guys going, like, this is unlikely, but we can't get over the fact that there's all of these people, all this evidence, all of this stuff happening. Yep. And it's pretty wild when you begin to kind of look at it from that perspective.
100%.
Yeah. A lot of what you alluded to is, in talking and reading Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, which, again, we've talked about a lot throughout the series because it really is such an incredible resource for someone who's investigating Jesus. And one of the things he talks about is he breaks down kind of the evidence for the missing body, what that looks like. He talks about the evidence for, the eyewitnesses seeing them later. And then he talks about circumstantial evidence. And in any court case, he talks about circumstantial evidence as, like, indirect. Like, it doesn't really have anything to do with, exactly what happened, but you have to, like, find a way to explain why this evidence took place. And is it aligned with what happened, or does it support something different? And he breaks down these 5 different pieces of circumstantial evidence that for him were game changers in this entire investigation. He talked about the number one was the changed lives of the disciples and the fact that they died for their beliefs. You talked about that already. You talked about some of these, I'm more putting these in a framework right now. But the fact that they died for the beliefs, again, they expected the Messiah to take the Roman Empire by storm. He dies on a cross. It should have all ended then, but it didn't. And again, people will die for their beliefs if they sincerely believe they're true, but people won't die for their beliefs if they know that they are false. And that's a really important point. That was one of the big ones for Lee Strobel that kind of pushed him over the edge too. Number 2, conversion of skeptics. Talk about James. Talk about Saul of Tarsus. The number 3 be changes to key social structures. So the fact that, like, so many things that were normalized for the Jewish people changed after the death of Jesus, and you have to find something to substantiate why these things changed. So Jews stopped regularly sacrificing animals after. That was a part of the old covenant. They were waiting on the new covenant to take that away. You have to explain, why did the Jewish people stop sacrificing animals on a regular basis? Why did their Sabbath change from Saturday to Sunday? Why do they not, take following Moses' law so strictly? All of these social changes within the Jewish people, you have to explain, like, why did those take place without the resurrection of Jesus? Communion and baptism, two of these Christian traditions that became normalized in culture, especially with followers of Jesus, obviously, but even they just became normalized in culture broadly too, who are aware of what communion and baptism are. These would have never had any sort of taken off in any way had there not been a reason for them taking off. And you have to explain why communion and baptism have become a thing culturally. And then the last one is the biggest one, just the emergence of the church. Like, historians look at it and they just how? How did this little sect eventually 300 years later become the official religion of the Roman Empire? And so, it talks about these circumstantial pieces of evidence, and you have to find something else to be able to substantiate how all these changes happened culturally. This isn't even the direct evidence. We're not even talking eyewitnesses, but we're talking these circumstantial things. How do you explain this? And when you begin to try to explain it, your conclusion is the most likely thing that happened is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And so that's why, coming full circle to go, did Jesus really die? There's a whole lot of evidence to suggest that he really did. It'd be a lot harder to explain that he didn't. And number two, did people really see him alive? There is so much evidence, circumstantial and direct, to support that is the case. And again, you have to decide if they did see him alive and he wasn't a resurrected Jesus, then how do you substantiate that? And I think for both you and I, we love talking about this stuff, love diving into it, but our conclusion is that it's the resurrected Jesus. And for us, that is I won't believe unless there's something divine, there's something godlike that happens. And if we're open to that, then it really does, that changes everything. And if someone is sitting on to this and listening to this podcast or watching this podcast, again, I would just reiterate the question that you asked on Sunday. What is the unless statement for you? I won't believe unless. What is that? What is that for you? Have you taken time to define that? And if so, what do you have to substantiate the all of the evidence that is there for the resurrection?
And then I think what's fun about that is it is like the launching point. Like if you were to land on yes, if you were to land on it, that's when we said the implications impact every area of our life, because that's why we trust the scriptures, right? That's why we see them as authoritative, is because Jesus saw them as authoritative, because he references the Old Testament, right? His very words are what inspire the writings of the Gospels. Those are why we trust the Bible, is because, I said it, kind of quickly on Sunday, but the idea of somebody can predict their own death and resurrection, pull it off. We go with what they say. Right? So it's the starting point. And then in the scriptures, then we find, where our identity is found, where meaningful relationships are found, hope, joy, peace, forgiveness, our future, what we hope and hold on to, and what we believe will be someday. It's a lived experience in every part of our life, not just this insurance policy kind of for someday. And so that's what gets me excited about this conversation too, is if you were to get there, and if you were to cross that line, it's like the beginning of an adventure that changes everything. So
and I think another implication is that your life is not just yours. What Jesus, the way he talks about the kingdom of God, the way he talked about how we live our lives in light of the fact that we are loved by God, we are children of God because of the cross. It means that we are to leverage us for the benefit of others. We are to take Jesus' example. Jesus said, love others as I have loved you. Jesus died he sacrificed everything for other people. We are to live the same way. And it changes everything about our lives.
Yeah. And I think, as you say about others, I think, this whole series that we just did, I think the content of Sunday, I do think that sincere followers of Christ should be versed in this kind of content, and I that doesn't mean that I expect everybody to be a scholar or have an intellectual bent or anything like that. But when Paul talks about having a defense for our faith, that is something that we should. Is that Paul or Peter? Did I just
Peter?
Is it Paul? It's Peter, isn't it?
First Peter. Yeah.
I caught myself as I said. I was like, that's not Paul. Having a defense of our faith. It's the idea is we should be able to explain the why, for our belief and so on. And there are all kinds of different ways that people come to Jesus. There are all kinds of different reasons and things that connect and compel. We actually talked about that a little bit in our Investigating Jesus series, but this is something that has implications. Even if you don't feel like you kind of struggle all that often with belief or, with doubt or whatever it might be, you care about somebody who does, and you can be that on ramp for somebody too. So,
yeah, for sure. I would say for anybody who is, right on the edge, again, the invitation is to take that step, accept Christ. And whether you've been in the room with us as we've, extended that invitation to you, or perhaps you're just sitting on the other side of this podcast, our hope is that if you're taking that step or you've taken that you would just tell someone about it, that you would talk to someone, share it with, one of us, reach out to us here on staff. We would love to meet with you and help you discover what's next for you in your faith. Or tell a trusted Christian friend that sent you the link to watch or invited you to Northpoint, whatever it might be. But tell someone about it, because we really believe it's the greatest decision you make in your life, and it really does change everything about your life. But it is the beginning of a journey, and it is an adventure, and it's the most beautiful thing. I was joking with Shane just in our office before we came in here, working on like upcoming series content, and it was like, hey, follow Jesus. Yes, it's really hard, but it's the most amazing thing you'll ever experience in your life, because it's where God designed us to experience a fullness of life. And we fully believe that. And it's so fun. You and I love doing all this, apologetics and talking about all this stuff. But the end in all of this means is really to inspire people to follow Jesus, and for us to get closer to him, understand why we believe the things that we do, and ultimately help people understand, the love of Jesus that God has for them as well. So that's a good place to end our podcast, this series. We're hoping that this content kind of lives on our website and helps people, or even serves as a tool for anybody who is trying to figure out how to have these conversations with friends who they're inviting to church or talking about Jesus with. And so we hope this content serves as a way you can do that. And I just want to let you know we're launching a brand new series upcoming this week that I hope makes everybody super uncomfortable. We are starting a new series called Comfort Zone, and it's a challenge for all of us and the comfort zones that we live in our lives. And so I think it's going to be helpful, challenging, uncomfortable, but leads to something ultimately better for all of us, and fuller of life and love and hope and all the things that we desire. So for those of you watching, listening, we can't wait to see you 9:30 and 11 live or on demand later on. We'll see you Sunday.